Color guard, halt. Color guard, cross the colors. Color guard, post the flag of the United States of America. Color guard, post the flag of the great state of California. Color guard, post the flag of the Silicon Valley Monterey Bay Council Boy Scouts of America. Color guard, honor your colors. Will the audience please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. 2. Color guard dismissed. Color guard, halt. Color guard, at ease. Audience, please join me in grace. For food, for raiment, for life, for opportunity, for friendship and fellowship, we thank thee, O Lord. Amen. Please be seated.
Please welcome this morning's Master of Ceremonies, the voice of the Sharks, and Eagle Scout, Dan Rusanowski.
Well, hello everybody, good morning. Welcome to our community breakfast. Our community leadership breakfast is an annual event which benefits the Silicon Valley Monterey Bay Council Boy Scouts of America. We've got really an incredible morning ahead. Today we get to meet a few leaders, some starting down that path as new scouts, people that are close to their eagles, and maybe a couple of other eagles, as I am myself, in the room today. But we also obviously have one leader who will share with us leadership lessons that she's employed that have really shaped our nation and continue to do so. I'm so looking forward to hearing from Dr. Condoleezza Rice today. And in fact, it reminds me of the fact that she's probably on my list of a short list of people who, if I could have anybody to dinner at my house to talk about anything, she would probably be on that list. And very similar to our general manager, Mike Greer, many of you may know, his brother Chris Greer is the general manager of the Miami Dolphins. And so at the Greer household, when they have dinner, Mike wants to talk about football and Chris wants to talk about hockey. Well, it'd probably be the same thing if I had dinner with Dr. Rice, because I'd want to talk about the vagaries of the international agreements with China and with Russia, and she would probably want to talk about the Sharks' power play, because she's definitely a hockey fan. Going to the University of Denver, that's what happens. But we're really thrilled to have not only Dr. Rice here today, but several other public officials that also are representing their communities, and there are so many of them. We'd like to ask those leaders to please stand for a moment. We have mayors here. We have a number of people from our fire department, including our fire chief in Santa Clara, Robert Sapien. And we also have people representing our explorer posts and many politicians, as I mentioned, council members, mayors, and even our outstanding longtime tax assessor, Larry Stone, is here today. Had a nice conversation with Larry, and he's all eager for the Sharks to have a great season next year as well. By the way, can I ask all of you leaders to please stand up right now? We have several mayors here. Thank you. And also, all of our fire people that are here today. We have the fire crew in uniform. Can you please stand? Thank you, guys. And also, we have a lot of great table sponsors that are on the screen. Let's extend a big thanks also to the table hosts. If you registered as a table host and you invited your friends and your neighbors and coworkers and some other strangers that might have joined you, please stand up for your table host, please. Thanks to all of you for being here. Now, I'd like to introduce our board president, Chris McGugan, who's going to share some of the very exciting things that scouting programs are offering youth in our community today. And I can tell you that as an Eagle Scout, and I say that in the present tense, there are many very critical programs being offered, and that's why we're here today. Chris?
No, thank you. And once an Eagle, always an Eagle. So when we think about youth today, I think in many cases, all of us kind of can sometimes get a little bit wrong. You know, we've got kids out there who are always staring at their screens, and we kind of think that that's what they're doing. But they're probably more connected than most of us think they are. And I think it's important that what we do as scouters enable those youth to see solid leadership skills. And that's what this is all about today, is really about empowering our youth to do something different. And we here in Silicon Valley Monterey Bay Council have that opportunity to touch the lives of nearly 10,000 youth across the community. And I can't thank you all enough for being here in support of all that we do and all that you do for scouting. Because I know many of the faces I see out here in the room are also fellow board members and scouters, as am I. And I really appreciate all that you've done for helping us continue to create the next generation of leaders here in America. Thank you. And if I don't read the script, I won't know what I'm supposed to do next. So I'd like to introduce Troop 673, who would like to tell you more about their time in scouting as well. Thank you.
My name is Sadie. I'm in Troops 673 and 2609, and I am on my trail to Eagle. In scouting, I believe that everyone and anyone can become a scout. It doesn't matter if you are gay, straight, non-binary, transgender, boy, girl, or cisgender. My leadership skills have culminated in me founding a new all-girls troop in Aptos and one in Scotts Valley. You can become a scout, and you can make your way to Eagle. In scouting, you'll learn more about leadership than you will in school. The life skills you'll learn will make a huge difference in your future. They'll help you lead a company, a team, or even lead to become the future president of the United States of America.
Hello, I'm Savannah, and I'm on my trail to Eagle. A couple members of my troop and I went on a kayaking trip in the San Juan Islands. We got put on the cover of a Scout Life magazine, which is on your table. During that trip, I learned so much about leadership and teamwork than I ever would have during school or everyday life. Kayaking through the very difficult channels of the San Juan Islands made me build really close bonds with my troop members, and I also grew as an individual, not just as a scout. Scouting has really changed my life and perspective on difficult situations, and because of scouting, I am more than confident to take on whatever challenges life throws at me.
Hi, I'm Jane, I'm 11, and I'm a first-class scout. My first year in scouting has given me leadership training and opportunities I would never have gotten at school. For example, as a patrol leader on our recent trip to Mount Madonna, I learned that leadership isn't about telling people what to do and making sure it gets done. It's more about helping them learn and figure it out themselves. I'm looking forward to another year of adventures that will build my confidence as a leader and as a human being. We graciously thank you for your time and for being here with us today.
As you can see, the Scouting organization has progressed quite a bit over the course of the last few years. We're welcoming both girls and boys into the organization, and that's something that is obviously a good sign for the future leaders of our country. At this point, I would like very much to talk about the purpose of why we're here and the values that Scouting instills. And I think it's very incumbent upon me to introduce another Eagle Scout, Doug Erickson, who is on the board with me for our local Scout Council here, and he can talk to you about that. Please welcome Doug Erickson.
Good morning, everybody. I expected a lot more applause, but we'll go with that. That's okay. There we go. Some people picked up on it. We need a little energy in the room, so. All right, good morning, everybody. For those of you that can, please join me in the 42 words that have made a difference in our world and will continue to make a difference in our world, both the Scout Oath and the Scout Law. Scout Oath? On my honor, I will do my best to do my duty to God and my country and to obey the Scout Law, to help other people at all times, to keep myself physically strong, mentally awake, and morally straight. The Scout Law. A Scout is trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent, too. Appreciate that. 42 words, counted to myself. I'm going to ask you to please join me in supporting this amazing organization. Our youth needs the character, the fitness, the leadership, and the citizenship learned through this great program. Table hosts, you know who you are. I'm going to ask you to open up those magical envelopes on your table and hand out the cards to your guests. And while you're doing that, guests, I'm going to ask you to cheerfully accept that card from your table host. And I'm going to ask you to think deeply about making an investment like nothing you've ever invested in before. This investment will pay greater dividends. Your investment will impact thousands of youth. And your investment is going to make a meaningful difference to everybody's life. Locally, it costs about $350 to support one Scout for a year. Today, I challenge you to invest in at least one Scout. At least one Scout. You can make your gift outright today by check or credit card, or you can make a pledge and we'll send you a bill. If you choose to use the QR code, there is a QR code on the card. If you choose to use the QR code, that's fantastic. I would ask you to still put your name and your amount on the card so we can tally it all up. We'll match it later. We're not going to charge you twice. I mean, maybe we will. You have till the end of this morning's event to do that. So maybe you want to pause for a second and hear all the wonderful things, and then you'll be inspired to make a better or bigger donation than you were before. And we'll come back after the end, after Dr. Rice takes the stage, and I'm going to say thank you, and I appreciate your thoughtfulness.
Thanks, Doug. 42 words. Think about those words. One of the most important parts of Scouting is that it imparts the idea to young boys and now girls that it's important to live a moral life. And I think that the principles of the Scout Oath and the principles of the Scout Law that we just went through are great guides to anybody's life. And that's something that's really, really important. I'd like to introduce our fireside moderator for our event today, Kevin Surace. Kevin is a business leader who is here to lead a very engaging discussion with Dr. Rice. Please welcome Kevin to the stage.
All right, now I'm going to ask my lovely people to come and push this back so everybody there can see what's going on stage. Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome. We've got almost 500 people in the room. Thank you for getting up so early and being here for this amazing conversation. It is my distinct honor and privilege to introduce our truly amazing keynote speaker and guest this morning, who is here donating her time for this wonderful organization. The 66th United States Secretary of State, Dr. Condoleezza Rice. Dr. Rice has served, oh, you can clap. Yeah, why don't you clap every line? I would do that. She deserves it. Dr. Rice has served as the Senior Fellow of Public Policy and a Director for the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. In addition, Dr. Rice has served as the Denning Professor of Global Business and Economy for the Stanford Graduate School of Business. Dr. Rice served as the Secretary of State and as Chief National Security Advisor to President George W. Bush. Now, I could go on for hours. In fact, it used to be a whole page, and I said, you're here to see her, not me. So I'm not going to go on for hours. Please join me in welcoming the amazing Dr. Rice on stage for what I promise is going to be quite the conversation. Thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Good morning. Good morning.
Thank you for the music, the sound. Congratulations to the sound team that put together some music. Look, years of public service, right? The board of a leading AI company, because AI is all in the news. You know, nobody cared about AI until a few months ago, and they started playing with ChatGPT. Right. But you've been on Tom Siebel's board 2009, maybe?
Right, 2010.
Something like, right? Yeah. Right, yes. Hoover Institution, concert pianist. By the way, concert pianist, you were featured in Steinway magazine not too long ago. Most people don't get Steinway magazine, but if you do, she's featured in Steinway magazine of all places. Who is Condoleezza Rice?
Well, first of all, it's because I bought a piano. Let's be very clear. I'm in Steinway magazine.
Well, I bought one. They didn't put me in the magazine, okay? Let's be clear.
Well, let's see. I do love being a professor, and I always think of my first and most important vocation as professor. I come from a family of educators. My mom was a teacher. My dad was a high school guidance counselor, Presbyterian minister, football coach, and later on university administrator. So I kind of grew up in that world. I also am I love music, as you said. I was a failed piano major. I actually went to college to be a piano performance major. Then went to the Aspen Music Festival School and learned what really good pianists could do, and decided I need a plan B, and so changed my major. I am, as was said, a sports fan. I will watch just about anything with a score at the end, but I am especially a huge fan of football these days, the Denver Broncos. I'm a small minority owner in the Denver Broncos, and yes, I am a Sharks fan. Were you a huge Sharks fan?
Dan over here, the announcer for the Sharks,
yes,
right?
Yes, because I grew up, I was born in Birmingham, Alabama, but I moved to Denver, my parents and I did, when I was 12, and the University of Denver did not have a football team, but it had a national championship hockey team. And I would rather watch hockey than almost anything other than perhaps football.
Fabulous, fabulous.
So that's a little bit about me.
Well, it's great because one thing about these interviews is you tend to learn a lot more of and you find out that people are, in the end, all just people. We're all just,
that's right.
We have our fun things that we love.
And there are things that are important to you. You know, I think growing up in Birmingham, as I did, there was really, in that little community, you have your pledges. Ours was faith, family, and education. And so as long as you were faithful, and I grew up religious, I still am, as long as you cared about family, and as long as you got an education, which nobody could ever take away from you, was the way that it was put, you could do just about anything.
I'm going to clap for that, because that is very aligned with scouting. So what gets you excited every morning when you get out of bed?
Well, first of all, I get out of bed really early. So
what's really early?
5 o'clock.
Okay.
Yes, because I was a competitive figure skater. You were on the ice really early, so I now
between piano and
right. It's a lot to do, and so this morning I was at my trainer at 5:15 before coming here. So I love the early morning. But what gets me excited is that I'm one of the lucky people who gets to do something for my quote-unquote work that I would gladly do if you didn't pay me a penny. I love to teach. I love ideas. At the Hoover Institution, where I'm the director, I bring together, I get to be with all of these great scholars on everything from K-12 education to foreign policy to technology. And we get to try and come up with well-designed answers to some of the country's biggest political problems. And so that for me is really exciting in the morning. I get to be in a university with young people. And I do think it's true, they are a little bit different than when we were young people. But they're amazing. They're the most high-minded generation I've taught in more than 30 years. And so that excites me. And then just getting up every day and seeing what in the world is going to happen today. I actually, and now that I don't really have to do anything about it, I'm not secretary anymore, I can get excited about it instead.
So what's the morning routine look like? You get out of bed at 5.
I get up at 5. I work out every morning. I then read the newspapers and so forth, and I do not take newspapers. I read online. And I have for 10, 12 years. So I read several newspapers. People ask me, how do you get your news in a day when news seems so slanted? And I always say, read as many different opinions as you can. I have a little ritual that I do, which is that I read at least one column of somebody who's going to make me really mad because I'm going to disagree with them. Because we all have a tendency these days to go into our little echo chamber and only read or talk to people who think like we do. So I go out of my way to read somebody who doesn't agree. I'm usually at work at about 8 o'clock. And my day is just kind of a blur from then. If I'm fortunate, I'll get home in time to practice the piano for an hour or so. And then often, because of my job as director, there's something in the evening. I try on weekends I'm finally going to church again. What do I mean by that? I was online along with everybody else. And then I got lazy about it. It was really easy to get up in your pajamas and go to church. So I'm trying to get back to making it in person. And then I try to play golf on Sundays. So that's my week.
That's quite the week.
Yeah.
You mentioned reading other opinions, and I've said this to people because we're going to talk about social media in a second.
Yeah.
People get down this rat hole today, and it's a constant feedback mechanism, and we start reading and seeing only the things that we already click on and read.
Yes.
You cannot form a rational argument with whoever your competitor is, whoever's on the other side, unless you read what they're thinking.
That's right.
So go read the other stuff. And by the way, half the time you go, that isn't actually a bad thought.
Right.
It's not how I would have come at it, but I can see why you're thinking that way, right? And so you actually have to, read the New York Times, read the Wall Street Journal. I'm being a little facetious, but you get the point, right?
No, that's just
take
about
both
right.
of them.
Read the New York Times, read the Wall Street
Journal. You've probably got both sides.
Yeah.
So you work with kids, you work with young adults. Social media. One thing we did not have when we were growing up is social media. That is literally scoring kids in high school and college as to popularity. And that's leading to teen suicides and just horrific things. Yes. Tell me your feelings about social media.
Well, it's both good and bad, obviously. It's connectivity. But I remember the first time that I heard, I'm going to friend somebody. And I thought, well, that's kind of an odd concept. I thought your friends were people you actually knew. And so from the beginning, it seemed to me to be something that could be alienating, if you will. And I think we see that for some kids it is. Come on, not all of us were popular in high school, but nobody knew it. If you're not popular in high school today, millions of people can know it. Mm-hmm. And I think it puts a lot of pressure on the kids. But we're not going to take it away from them. The fact is they were born with those little things in their hand. They cannot be separated from their phones for more than a few minutes without some anxiety. And so I think we have to teach them how to learn to manage this. Mm-hmm. And I have friends who I tell my kids, you're just not going to have the phone with you during dinner or doing this or doing that. I think activity is really important. One reason I think scouting can play a role or organized sports is you actually can't be on your phone while you're
not when you're climbing a rope.
Not when you're climbing a rope.
We need all our hands for something else.
Right, or not when you're figure skating, or not when you're golfing, and so, or not when you're playing an instrument. And so I think one answer is to get them active and kind of off the sofa. The other thing is that I tell my kids, and remember I now have older, my students are 18, 19, 20 years old, and one of the things that I do is I actually recruit for Stanford athletics. So I was doing a recruiting session for the football team a few days ago. And I said to them, you know, there's all this stuff about name, image, and likeness, right? And you've heard of it, NIL, and they get to benefit from their name, image, and likeness. I said, but remember, your name, image, and likeness is for a lifetime. Whatever you sign on today is going to follow you forever. And so helping them to understand that that's the way social media is, that what they do on social media has to protect their reputation today, I think is also a way to help them. And then finally, on the point of hearing people who think differently, I just tell my kids flat out two things. First of all, you do not have a constitutional right not to be offended. Nobody wrote that into the Constitution. So, if you're offended, before you organize the university on White Plaza to protest because you were offended, why don't you turn to the person next to you and say, you know, that was offensive. Now we can have a conversation about what that was, and if they meant to offend, you've called them out, but more likely they kind of didn't know. And then when you offend, others will give you a break. So let's try to level the playing field a little bit, but everybody gets respect and we can talk things out. The second thing that I tell them is, if you find yourself constantly in the company of people who say amen to everything you say, find other company. Because you will not, as you said, you'll never develop the ability to sustain an argument. I taught a course for the last several years. I'm not teaching right now, but it was considered a very difficult course. They read 500 pages a week. They wrote a 5-page paper every week. I read 25 5-page papers every week. And we had a 3-hour session every week in class. Now, one reason that I had them write a 5-page paper every week, and this is something we have to be very cognizant of with youth, is that they can't sustain an argument. They can't write. I don't mean they can't make subject and verb agree. They can do that. But I used to say to them, did you just intend to kind of start this and wander to the end and hope for the best? I said, you know, we used to do something called an outline when I was in college, in high school. And so
there's a beginning,
there's a
middle, there's an end, there's a point of the story.
And they have to learn to do that also in oral argumentation. And if it's just, well, I feel like, which I do not allow in my class, I feel like, I don't care what you feel. I really want to know, what can you understand? What can you demonstrate? What evidence do you have? And then you have to be able to take your argument and go at somebody who thinks differently and make a rational argument. And so civility of argumentation, the ability to listen to people with whom you disagree, even if it's really hard. We have this thing these days that we talk about harmful language. I just hate that term, because you're going to run into people who are jerks from time to time. And you have to learn how to handle that too. You know, in my family, we had my parents, I grew up in a little segregated part of Birmingham. I think everybody in that neighborhood taught school. There's one doctor, one lawyer, everybody else taught school. And they would say, you have to be twice as good. Now remember, this is segregated Birmingham. And they meant, if you're going to succeed, you're going to have to prove yourself twice over because of prejudice and so forth. So they didn't say, it's a shame you're going to have to be twice as good. It's unfair you're going to have to. They just said, you have to be twice as good. So we went around trying to be twice as good. Now we work twice as hard. Now we're twice as confident. And that little community produced an amazing array of successful professionals. Then they said, there are no victims. The minute you tell yourself you're a victim, you are giving control of your life to somebody else. You may not be able to control your circumstances. You can control your response to your circumstances. And so I say always, ironically, I'm grateful that I grew up in segregated Birmingham, because I learned important lessons that I think have taken me through life.
For sure. How do you touched on this a little bit, but this has happened at Stanford. Two things. One, you know, the long list of verboten words that you're not allowed to use. I read that list, and at some point I said, if I was teaching there, I would not I'd failed. I should just
Yeah.
quit.
Yeah.
I can't even remember, there was page after page after page of someone in HR that said, you can no longer use this because you might offend someone, so therefore you have to use this. And I understand, clearly there's some words in the English language that are highly offensive. We get that. And that's 10 or 20. But this was hundreds.
Yeah.
It's impossible to teach that way.
No, and nobody does. I mean, the fact is, it was actually the IT department that put it together.
Oh, and those are the people who know.
Right. And
because they are the most offensive.
right, yeah.
Sorry, IT professionals.
Yes.
Least offensive.
But fortunately, the university backed off of it right away. Okay, they said this is not official policy. I actually thought it was a joke when I saw it, and then they told me no, it's not a joke, and so the university backed off of it. And again, I don't want to offend the IT people, but probably the best line was from the students with the Stanford Review who said, yes, the IT department has spent all of this time making a harmful word list, but they can't deploy a usable search engine for admissions, right? So it kind of became, and so nobody actually believes that we should do that. But it does say something about the kind of mentality that, and things went on there like you can't say American. Well, I was kind of the American Secretary of State. People understood that.
I think I might use the term American. How did that become offensive?
Well,
it could be offensive to some people.
Yeah, the idea was America is bigger than the United States of America.
I saw that,
right?
yeah.
But I've never heard a Brazilian call themselves an American.
Right.
Or a Canadian call themselves an American. And so actually, American is an incredibly inclusive term. Because what are we saying? We're saying we come from all kinds of ethnic backgrounds.
Right.
Our ancestors came from all kinds of nationalities. You can be Korean American, you can be Mexican American, you can be German American, but you're American, so that it is a term that means there is no ethnic, national, or religious definition of what it is to be American. So it's actually a wonderfully inclusive term. And I explained that to somebody and they said, I'd never thought of that. And I thought, well, we're doing something wrong if you haven't thought of that.
Right.
Yeah.
Along that thread, and then we'll get on to some world stuff, and again, you sort of touched on this, but this happened at Stanford over the last year, is some organization on Stanford, as you know, at Stanford or Berkeley or Santa Cruz or whatever, says, hey, we're going to have all these speaker series, right? We're going to have a bunch of speakers on, and some of them are far left, and some of them are far right, and some of them are in the middle, and some of them have some views that some people might say are uncomfortable for a particular race or whatever it is, right? And then the kids go and protest and demand that the president of the university step down because they allowed this speaker on campus. I mean, the whole idea of college campus, for as long as any of us remember, was to have all these alternative ideas come and the students can learn. They can agree or disagree, but you can hear all these different ideas. And now they just demand that the president resigns every time there's a speaker on campus. How do you feel about that?
Well, it's crazy. And actually, I think there's a backlash against it. I think the middle is taking control again. So when the really awful incident happened at the Stanford Law School, and we had a conservative judge, and nobody minded if students wanted to hold up signs or so forth, but they are not supposed to disrupt, and it was tremendously disrupted. Unfortunately, an administrator got in the mix who didn't help things. But the dean of the law school did something very, very interesting. She is a First Amendment lawyer. Constitutional lawyer. And so she wrote a lengthy legal brief that basically said, you're in law school and you don't understand the First Amendment. Therefore, I'm going to explain it to you, to her law students. And oh, by the way, you're going to have a half-day session on the First Amendment. Now, that was actually really effective, I think. So it isn't always just saying to them, you shouldn't act that way. It's sort of saying, all right, we're going to go back to basics. And you have a right to protest, but you don't have a right to disrupt. And oh, by the way, you're about to be lawyers, and you aren't going to get to choose the judge to whom you go, and so you probably ought to learn to live with people who have differing views. And so I think these situations can be turned to the good. And I'm involved through the Hoover Institution, which is center-right in our orientation. We're not partisan, but Herbert Hoover created us with, as a part of Stanford University, but with 3 principles. He said the human condition can be improved by individual liberty, by limited government, and by private enterprise. And on the basis of those values, we do research that takes us wherever it takes us. We don't cook the books in our research. But we are a part of Stanford, and I have never had more requests to get Hoover Fellows involved in this and Hoover Fellows involved in that, because the president, particularly of Stanford, and the provost, recognize that universities have gone too far the other way. So I think there's room to win this back.
It's unclear to me how in this country that somehow thinking about, maybe government shouldn't be so big, and maybe private industry actually works a lot of the time. How did that become right?
Yeah, I know.
It just is. I mean, the whole country was built that way. It wasn't meant to be political.
That's exactly what
it was a little bit like COVID wasn't really meant to be political.
Yeah.
It just is. I can't change it.
These days, everything is. But we, actually at Hoover, we have people who are Democrats and Republicans. We're across the board. But those key values, I did say once in the Faculty Senate when they said something about limited government, I said, I think that's the Reserve Powers Clause of the United States Constitution. Mm-hmm. So some of this is just...
It is in the Constitution.
Yeah, it is, that all powers that are not reserved to the federal government are reserved to the states and to the people.
Right. That's right.
And so but some of it is we just have to get in and make the argument. And I'm more than willing to make the argument.
Quite effectively, I believe. So if you had been here 2 or 3 years ago and I said, let's talk about world politics, we'd all go, there's nothing to talk about.
Yeah.
However, in the last year and a half or so, there is a lot to talk about.
There is.
And I'm going to open with China. Because China has gone from what a great low-cost place to make things, and we all buy them, to not making any opinions here, just sort of the news, right? They're stealing intellectual property. They're using our intellectual property. They've been doing so for a very long time, as it turns out, and they really want to get Taiwan back in a more aggressive way than they've been. And they've closed their borders, and they've gone and jailed people that we know. I mean, they've really become sort of a communist country. And I think again, they've been a communist country, but they're really acting that way. And I think some wake up to many Americans was, of course, Russia, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but we've got these 2 big communist powerhouses, and I've started telling people, when people say, well, what do you think? Like, I don't know, but I go, well, maybe it's actually a bad idea to actually do business with communist countries. This doesn't end well. It's going to end badly. So let's start with China. What's going on, and where do you think that ends?
Well, you're right. About 3 years ago or so, the re-emergence of, let me just call it great power conflict, right? For after the end of the Cold War, it looked like there was kind of only one model. It was ours, and we were pretty dominant. And then, and even China, after Deng Xiaoping decided to pull China out of isolation, China joined the international economy.
Yeah.
So that was the bet that you're talking about.
Yeah.
So the bet was, you've got 1.4 billion people. They're very creative. They're very industrious. Do you want to have them outside the system or inside the system? And people made a bet that if you integrated China into the international economy, then yes, we had problems with intellectual property. Yes, they didn't have open markets. Yes, they manipulated their currency. But over time, that would change, because as they became a more responsible partner in the international economy, which, by the way, they were benefiting from greatly, because they lifted 500 million people out of poverty by that relationship.
They would see the value of this system.
They would see the value, and they would do what and there was also a piece of it that people said, you can't have economic liberalization and political control. Right? So I worked with Jiang Zemin. I worked with Hu Jintao. These were the prior presidents. And yeah, they were communists, but they kind of understood that they were benefiting from this system. And moreover, they didn't really want to raise their heads up in terms of Chinese power. They were doing something that Deng Xiaoping called bide and hide. So you're not that powerful. Bide your time, hide. Enter Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping has a completely different view of how China ought to operate in the international system. And effectively, he says, if you give me a choice between economic liberalization and political control, thank you very much, I'll take political control. And that was an answer we weren't prepared for, because everybody thought it was going to be economic liberalization. Now, it has some costs to China, and we have to recognize that. You probably are familiar, zero COVID basically stalled out the economy. They're still trying to find ways to grow because of that. Sometimes I hear what I'll call authoritarian envy. Right? Oh, they build such great airports. Oh, their roads are so nice. Oh, we can't do anything in our democracies. Every time you hear somebody who has authoritarian envy, just say the following to them: the one-child policy. The one-child policy, instituted by the Chinese Communist Party some decades ago, 30, 40 years ago, and now 34 million Chinese men don't have mates. And now India has just surpassed China in terms of population. Yep. So they are making mistakes. And we have to recognize that they're an adversary. That's how they see themselves. That's who they are. When it comes to their foreign policy, they engaged in something called wolf warrior diplomacy. Now, wolf warrior and diplomacy are not words you usually hear together. And so they did things like tell Australia they were gum under the shoe of China. They went to a border with India and beat up Indian soldiers. The border had been quiet for 40 years. Well, you know, this produced a backlash. And before you knew it, India, the United States, Japan, and Australia had formed something called the Quad. Australia, Great Britain, and the United States had formed something called AUKUS. And countries from Vietnam and the Philippines were inviting the United States to have bases there. And somebody woke up in China and said, this is not exactly having the impact we had hoped. And so now Xi Jinping is on a charm offensive. You may have seen that he went and made peace in the Middle East between Iran and Saudi Arabia. My guess is it won't last, but that's all right. That's what he wanted to do. Now he's telling the United States, you know, I can probably help negotiate a peace between Ukraine and Russia. This is after having told the Russians that they were in a relationship without limits. Now, I know how this conversation went. Took place at the, I mean, I don't really, but I can imagine. Took place at the Beijing Olympics, all right? So Putin, they signed the relationship without limits. You're right, they're both, you know, the Russians aren't so much communists these days as they are really nationalist, right? This is about the Russian Empire. But they're both dictators, and the West is weak, and they looked at the way we pulled out of Afghanistan. They said we don't keep our commitments. And so they signed their relationship without limits. And I suspect that Putin says to Xi Jinping, you know, I got to do this thing in Ukraine. And it'll take 4 or 5 days. You understand because you've got the Taiwan problem. And Xi Jinping says, fine, just don't do it until after the Olympics is over. And a year and 2 months later, Xi Jinping finds himself in bed with a homicidal maniac who is bringing sanctions down on everybody. And as you know, I was a figure skater. All right, well, a figure skate is a 1/4-inch blade. The Chinese are on a 1/4-inch blade. On the one hand, they want the Russians to win, and they really don't want to see Putin lose. That would be good for us, the United States. So they want to help, but on the other hand, they don't want to do anything that would bring sanctions down on their economy. So when our administration wisely let it be known that we knew that they were considering arming the Russians, they said, no, we're not doing that, because they know that if they were caught arming the Russians, you would have sanctions against the Chinese economy just like that. They need growth. They can't afford further sanctions. And so it's a challenge dealing with the Chinese. You mentioned Taiwan. Part of Xi Jinping's thing is that he wants to end up next to Mao in the kind of Chinese pantheon. He's already disposed of Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. Deng Xiaoping, he's passing by, and then he'll be next to Mao. But in order to do that, he has to restore China. What does that mean? They've already restored Hong Kong. Hong Kong is just another province of China now. And now, what about Taiwan, which is the last missing piece? You had Jim Mattis here last year. I think military people will tell you that to try to invade Taiwan in an amphibious landing is kind of like D-Day on steroids. And probably the Chinese can't pull that off. But what they can do is they can bring all kinds of pressure on Taiwan. We saw in the exercises that they did at the time of Nancy Pelosi's ill-advised visit, we saw the exercises looked like what military people call denial exercises. In other words, a kind of blockade so that they couldn't trade, cyber attacks. And what's the goal? The goal is to get a really pro-Beijing government in Taiwan. At the time that President Tsai was meeting with Kevin McCarthy in California, the head of the opposition, or the former head of the opposition party, the KMT, was in Beijing. And so, you know, you can imagine the KMT in the elections, which are in January, saying, you know, we can end all of this unpleasantness. And so I think the Chinese will play in the Taiwanese election. I think they'll use cyber attacks. I think they'll bring pressure. But an all-out invasion seems to me pretty foolhardy. Not that people don't do foolhardy things, but it would be pretty tough.
Interesting. Let alone the assets that they want there, including TSMC, the
largest semiconductor in the world. And by the way, they have the one of the salutary things about Ukraine is maybe Xi Jinping has learned two lessons. First of all, the West did get its act together. By West, I mean Japan and others, got its act together and brought sanctions, pretty tough sanctions on Russia. The second thing is maybe your army's not as good as you think they are. Certainly, Vladimir Putin thought his army was good, and they're not. As a matter of fact, they're pretty awful.
Well, that's a great segue to Russia and Ukraine. When General Mattis was here last year, he was quick to point out that he never felt that the Russian army was any good. It's a railroad army. It gets its supplies on rail, and you basically cut off their supplies, and they're in trouble. And actually, they mostly like to get drunk rather than fight, and they're conscripts, and they don't want to be there at all. I know that's probably not PC to say that the Russian army gets drunk, but nevertheless, they do.
It happens to be true.
It happens to be true. I read it in the New York Times. So, and the Wall Street Journal. Both sides say the Russians like to get drunk.
Right.
So look, I want to know, what do you think was going on in Putin's head at that moment? And we knew he was going to invade, and he certainly did. And then, you know, where does that lead? Where is it now? And how does it end?
Well, I think he made three big miscalculations. One, I mentioned that the West wouldn't do anything. You know, we had, and Afghanistan caused us more credibility than anybody recognizes, because if you devote 20 years to a place and then you leave with people hanging off the ends of your transport planes, you don't recover from that. So that, I think, was part of it. Secondly, he really did think his army was good. They had spent billions and billions of that. Their performance in Georgia was awful. They did have a lot of drunk soldiers. They basically ended up kind of where they started in Georgia. And so since 2008, they had spent a lot of money trying to remake their armed forces. And they even were trying experiments. So in 2006, the then defense minister, Sergei Ivanov, asked Don Rumsfeld, he said, tell me about those sergeant majors, right? He said, those people seem important to your armed forces. They don't have NCOs. So they have entitled, arrogant, corrupt officers and 18-year-old conscripts. And they have constant morale problems. They also don't move, as Jim said. They are an army that was never meant to go on the offensive, really. An army that can maneuvers with trucks, not rail. And so Putin just miscalculated about his army. Most importantly, he misunderstood the Ukrainians. You know, Russians, even liberal Russians, will make this mistake that the Ukrainians are just kind of our Ukrainian brothers. They're just kind of Russians with an accent. There's a Tchaikovsky suite called the Little Russia Suite. It's about Ukraine. Right? So there's a mentality that, of course, they're us. They will welcome us, because that group that's in Kyiv, they're just not. So the Russian army went to the war with 5 days provisions and their dress uniforms for the parade in Kyiv. So that's what they thought was going to happen.
Right.
Now,
Oops.
Didn't happen, and now they're changing their tactics. It's absolutely true they're a terrible army, but they bring two things. They bring mass, and I think Putin has decided time can be on his side. We'll get tired, the Ukrainians will get tired, but mass, he can just throw untrained Russian men at it.
Who die?
They're
And
just
Putin doesn't care.
No, they're just cannon fodder.
Right.
And he'll engage in terrorist activities against Ukrainian civilians. So you've seen apartment buildings, the grid, et cetera. So that's his battle plan.
They're very good at shooting little old ladies, but not good
at much else. And so they'll do what they're good at, throw mass at it and engage in terrorist attacks. And so how does it end? I don't think either Ukraine or Russia are thinking about that just yet. Eventually, we will know more. Right now, they're in a period of time. The Russians have a great word for it. It's called smukh. It's not quite mud, not quite snow. It's something in between. Hitler and Napoleon both got caught in it. And so right now, nobody can move. Pretty soon, the Ukrainians may launch this long-expected counteroffensive. We'll sort of see in July, August, where everybody is. And I think at that point, people will start thinking, have the Ukrainians taken enough territory that they can rebuild a sustainable, independent Ukraine? What does that agreement look like? Is Putin tired of the fight? That's, I think, where people are going. Because right now, neither side is ready to come to the table.
When you look at the daily cost of the war, depending on whose source you look at, it's many, many billions of dollars for Russia.
Yeah.
The Russian economy isn't that big. They may have spent $1.5–2 trillion. You may have better numbers than I do, but numbers like that on this war, they don't have $2 trillion.
No.
That's a ridiculous number. We could barely afford that. They are an economy that is much, much, much smaller than us.
That's right. But
at some point, don't they run out of money?
No, because Russian suffering is just part of the lore,
It's good.
It's right. And what they'll do is they're getting some money from selling discounted oil, right, to places like India. And so they'll keep doing that. It's not the full amount, but they will get some revenue there. They're actually doing a pretty effective job of substitution of consumer goods. So there, you may not be able to buy a really nice refrigerator that's a Western-made refrigerator, but the one that they made in Kazakhstan is kind of okay. And so you're seeing a lot of that. But the longer term, 800,000 or so, maybe 1 million Russians have left, because about 500,000...
The smart ones.
The smart ones. About 500,000 people left right when the war started. They were entrepreneurs, they were knowledge-based workers, they were coders, they were software engineers. They got out. They were in Azerbaijan and Turkey and wherever they could get to. And then another 300 to 400,000 Russian men got out when they started the general mobilization. So the population is down of its most creative people. Secondly, Russian oil and gas, which depended very much on Western technology to develop these very remote oil fields in places like Sakhalin Island. They won't be able to do that because except for the majors, Exxon, BP, and others, nobody has that technology. So their production is going to be in the tank for a long time. But I think they'll just keep suffering. Putin is not, I think, fully being told the truth. He believes that sooner or later we will get tired. That's what he's waiting for.
I think he's going to wait a very long time.
I think he's going to wait a long time, too. But I'll tell you, every time he hears from the far left of the Democratic Party and from the far right of the Republican Party, what are we doing in Ukraine? I can guarantee you that's the clipping that they put on his desk. Because you don't like to give Putin bad news. So you find the good news.
Because you get thrown out the window every single time.
Well, you're just clumsy and you fall out the window.
Yes, you fall out the window.
There have been
Amazing.
several
Every single time.
Several of those really, really clumsy oligarchs who just keep falling out of hospital windows. It's really amazing.
I'm going to ask you one last world question before we wrap, which is Iran. A lot of, not everybody is aware of this, but Iran has been able to perhaps enrich uranium to levels that are usable in nuclear weapons. They keep saying they're not making nuclear weapons. We know they are.
Yeah.
That is what they're doing. What's your 1 minute thought on what happens? How do us and the Israelis and maybe others deal with that? Because I don't think we can accept a nuclear terrorist organization.
We made a mistake in signing the agreement. That's water under the bridge. But look, there are three elements of a nuclear capability. You have to have a delivery system, you have to have a bomb design, you have to have fuel.
Yep.
We know they've got we believe they've got all
Pieces
three,
of them, yeah.
but probably haven't married them. And if they're smart, they won't. Because as long as they're kind of latent in their capability, people might tolerate it. The minute it looks like they're trying to make that capability operational in any way, somebody will take care of it. And it probably won't have to be us. Let me just put it that way.
Yeah, I have a feeling there's some people very close by who may need some refueling from us, but other than that, they can take it themselves.
Yeah.
So Scouting prepares young people for high integrity leadership. Just give me your sort of 30 seconds on why Scouting is important to deliver the leaders of the future.
Well, it's important because you don't just declare them leaders, you actually give them a pathway to leadership. I can't tell you how many kids come into me and they say, I want to be a leader. And I say, that's not a job description and it's not a destination. All right, so let's talk about how one gets there. You get there through exercising it, through helping your fellow scouts or your fellow students or whatever to organize themselves. You have to learn leadership characteristics. And I think Scouting is really built on learning leadership characteristics, not just declaring somebody leaders. I think it was Jane, if I got her name right, who said something I always say about leadership, which is leadership is not you leading. It is seeing leadership characteristics in others and enabling a team to lead. And that's what the best leaders do. And I think that's what you do in Scouting.
Finally, please join me in thanking Dr. Condoleezza Rice today.
Great job. Great job.
Thank you.
Celebrate good times, come on. Celebrate.